A man in front of me picked up the last $2 lottery ticket in the store, held it in his hand for a long moment like he was weighing something invisible, and then put it back on the rack and walked out without a word. I picked it up 30 seconds later. When I checked the numbers, I had won $74 million. I had never played the lottery before in my life. But when I called the regional claims office, the man on the other end of the line went quiet. "Ma'am," he finally said quietly, "I need to warn you. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Nora Ashcroft, and I want to tell you about the night my quiet, careful life turned into something I never could have planned for, and about everything that came crawling out of the woodwork once the money became real. Before all of this, I was the kind of woman nobody notices twice. Not tragic, not lonely in a way that made for a good dinner party story, just quietly overlooked. I was 58 years old, working as a billing coordinator for Meadowbrook Dental Partners, a regional dental group with 6 clinics scattered across Tulsa, Oklahoma. I drove a 2011 Toyota Corolla with an air conditioner that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. I rented a small brick duplex on East 21st Street, kept 3 tomato plants dying slowly on the back step, and spent my Friday nights watching cooking competition shows with my dog, Pepper, a terrier mix with one ear that never stood upright. My daughter, Julia, was 27 and lived 15 minutes away in Broken Arrow. We texted most days and talked on the phone every Sunday evening. That was my life. Small, steady, entirely mine. I had been married once, to a man named Roger. We divorced when Julia was 11. It wasn't a war. It was just a long, slow fade. 2 people who had run out of things to say to each other over the breakfast table. Roger remarried within 2 years, to a woman named Christine, younger, brighter, always laughing at some joke I wasn't in the room for. They moved to Tampa. I stayed in Tulsa. I told myself I didn't mind, and mostly I didn't. What I did mind, though I hadn't let myself say it out loud yet, was what had been happening at work for the better part of a year. It started small. Insurance claims I had processed and flagged for review kept getting marked resolved before anyone had actually looked at them. I mentioned it once at a Monday staff meeting. Carefully, the way you mention something you're not sure is even worth mentioning. My supervisor, Frank Delgado, gave me a smile that didn't move past his teeth and said the system had simply been streamlined. Sitting beside him, taking notes without looking up, was Renee Castellano, the office manager who had been passed over for Frank's position 2 years earlier and had never once let anyone forget it. Renee wore her hair in a tight bun and smelled faintly of the same vanilla lotion every single day. And if this story has a villain, it is her, glasses pushed up on her head, pen moving fast against a legal pad. I started watching more closely after that. At home, I kept a plain composition notebook, the kind Julia used to use for school, and in it I logged discrepancies. Claims that had been submitted twice under different codes. Reimbursement requests that vanished from the system entirely. A vendor invoice that showed up in March and disappeared by June like it had never existed. Was I being paranoid? Maybe. But here is something I have learned in 58 years on this earth. Women who have spent decades doing careful, invisible work without a shred of recognition notice things. We notice everything. We just don't usually say it out loud because we've learned that saying it out loud rarely changes anything. That was where things stood on a Thursday evening in late October when I stopped at the Quick Trip on 71st Street on my way home to grab dog food and a 6-pack for the weekend. I was tired in the specific way that comes from a decade of sitting at a desk under fluorescent lights that make everyone look faintly unwell. I was standing in line behind a man I'd never seen before, maybe 70, wearing a flannel jacket even though it wasn't cold yet, and I watched him reach the small lottery display near the register. It was almost empty. One ticket left, a Powerball ticket, $2, sitting slightly crooked in its slot like it had been waiting there specifically. The old man picked it up. He turned it over once in his fingers. Then, without any explanation, he set it back down exactly where it had been and walked out of the store empty-handed. I don't play the lottery. I've never played the lottery. I think of it the way I think of carnival games, a polite, consensual robbery dressed up as hope. But that night, maybe it was the ache in my lower back, maybe it was the memory of Renee's blank, assessing face from the meeting 2 days earlier, I stepped up and picked up that last ticket before I let myself think twice about it. "Guess it was meant for you," the cashier said, a teenager who barely glanced up as he rang me through. "Story of my life," I told him, and meant it more than he could have known. I tucked the ticket into the front pocket of my purse and forgot about it almost immediately. That night I fed Pepper, poured myself a glass of wine, and fell asleep halfway through a rerun about competitive bakers. I found the ticket again the next evening, crumpled slightly at the bottom of my purse, and checked the numbers on my phone out of pure habit, the way you check the weather without expecting anything to have changed. Then I checked again. Then I sat very still at my kitchen table for what I later realized was almost 5 minutes. Then I called the number listed on the Oklahoma Lottery website. A recording told me to contact the regional claims manager, a man named Hal Bregman, during business hours. I called anyway. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. I read him my numbers. I heard him typing. Then I heard nothing at all for a long moment, followed by a slow exhale. "Ma'am," Hal Bregman said, and something in his voice had shifted, gone careful, almost reluctant. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Before you do anything at all, before you tell a single soul, there are some things you need to understand." My hand tightened around the phone. "What kind of things?" Another pause. "The kind," he said slowly, "that can protect you completely or ruin you completely, depending on what you do in the next few days." I looked down at Pepper, who was staring up at me from the kitchen floor with total, uncomprehending devotion. Outside, Tulsa went on being Tulsa, ordinary, unhurried, a little sleepy on a Friday night. Nothing was going to be ordinary again. Hal asked me to come into the regional office the following Monday morning, and he gave me a short, specific list of instructions. Bring the physical ticket, bring a valid photo ID. And this was the part that made my breath catch. Do not deposit any money anywhere, do not contact a bank, and do not tell anyone, including family, until we had spoken face to face. "Not even my daughter?" I asked. "Especially not your daughter," he said. "Ma'am, I know how that sounds. But $74 million creates a very specific kind of problem, and I have watched it destroy people who weren't ready for it. Please trust me on this." I thanked him and hung up, and then I sat at my kitchen table for nearly 3 hours running through every possible disaster that could befall a woman alone with a lottery ticket worth $74 million. I thought about my sister, Patty, who lived across town in Sand Springs and had been asking me for small loans since her divorce 4 years earlier. $60 here, $100 there, always wrapped in a story just plausible enough that I never wanted to push back. I thought about Christine, Roger's wife, who had once told me at Julia's college graduation that I looked so put together considering. I thought about Frank Delgado and Renee Castellano and the claims that kept quietly disappearing. And I thought about Julia and how badly I wanted to call her right then and say, "Baby, something incredible just happened." But I didn't, because Hal Bregman had told me not to, and something in the gravity of his voice, not panic exactly, but the flat seriousness of a man who had seen this go wrong before, convinced me he was right to ask. Instead, I pulled out my composition notebook, the same one where I had been tracking the discrepancies at work, and I flipped to a fresh page. At the top I wrote one word, exposure. I drew a line down the center. On one side I wrote, who knows. On the other, who cannot know yet. On the left, I wrote Hal Bregman. On the right, I wrote everyone else in my life. Patty, Julia, Roger, Christine, Frank, Renee, my neighbor Dale, who was harmless but incapable of keeping a secret past lunchtime, my coworker Yolanda, who I genuinely loved, but who had the discretion of a car alarm. I stared at that page for a long time. Then I made myself think about what I actually knew about lottery winners in this country, which, admittedly, wasn't much. I knew that a staggering number of them end up broke within a handful of years. I knew that predatory financial advisors circled new winners like gulls behind a fishing boat. I knew relatives had a way of resurfacing, relatives you hadn't heard from in years, the moment money became public knowledge. And I knew that in Oklahoma, a winner's name became public record unless the prize was claimed through a trust. A trust. I wrote the word down and underlined it twice. I didn't know the first thing about trusts. I processed dental insurance claims for a living. But I knew how to research something methodically. I had spent nearly a year quietly documenting irregularities at work with nothing but a notebook and a library card, and I figured I could learn enough in a single weekend to walk into Monday's meeting with something resembling a plan. I made coffee. I opened my laptop. I spent that entire Friday night and all of Saturday reading everything I could find about lottery claim structures, blind trusts, limited liability companies used as claiming entities, and state-by-state privacy laws. I took real notes, organized, specific, the kind of notes I hadn't taken since I was working my way through community college at night while Julia was small. By Sunday morning, I had a rough framework. It wasn't perfect, and I knew I needed an actual lawyer, someone who specialized in exactly this, but I had enough to walk into Monday's meeting asking the right questions instead of just nodding along. I learned that some states let winners remain fully anonymous, and others made it nearly impossible, and that Oklahoma sat somewhere in the middle, offering a narrow but real path if you moved through the right legal channel before the story ever reached a reporter's desk. I learned the difference between a revocable trust and an irrevocable one, and why an independent trustee mattered more than I would have guessed. And I learned that some winners had been tracked down by strangers within days simply because a court filing somewhere had used their real name instead of an entity's. I read about winners who had signed away shares of their winnings to people who claimed to have always believed in them, and winners who had bought houses for cousins they hadn't spoken to in a decade, and winners who 5 years later were back exactly where they'd started, poorer for having been rich for a little while. None of that was going to be me. I decided that on a folding chair at my own kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee at 2 a.m, and I meant it. The biggest trap, according to nearly everything I'd read, was moving too fast. The second biggest trap was trusting the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. I thought again about Patty, about the pattern of those small loans, the way each request came preloaded with just enough self-deprecation to make refusing feel unkind. I thought about how she would react when she eventually found out, not if, when, because even with a trust, some things have a way of surfacing eventually in a family. And I thought about how much I love my sister, and how loving someone has never once required being naive about them. That afternoon, I called a small estate planning firm in downtown Tulsa I'd found through an hour of searching, and left a message for an attorney named Monica Reyes. I didn't explain why I was calling. I said only that I needed to discuss a significant and confidential financial matter. Then I wrapped the lottery ticket in a paper towel, sealed it inside a sandwich bag, and hid it inside an old shoebox at the back of my closet, tucked beneath a stack of tax returns I hadn't looked at in 3 years. Not glamorous, but effective. Monday morning I dressed carefully, nothing that would draw a second look, dark slacks and a plain navy blouse, and drove downtown to the regional lottery office. Hal Bregman turned out to be a compact, careful man in his early 60s with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, and the manner of someone who has delivered both very good news and very bad news for decades, and long ago learned to keep his face neutral for either one. He shook my hand and closed the office door behind us. "Before we start," he said. "I want to be honest with you about something. Technically, my job is just to process claims. What I'm about to tell you isn't part of that job. But I've done this for 19 years, and I've watched what happens to people who walk in here unprepared. I sleep better when I say it out loud, so I say it every time." "Say it," I told him. He leaned forward. "Mrs. Ashcroft, the moment this becomes public, your life is going to change in ways you are not ready for. There are people who make a living finding new winners before those winners have protected themselves. There are attorneys who will find your address within 48 hours of any public filing. There is family, even family you trust with your life, who will surprise you." "I understand," I said. "You don't, not yet," he said, not unkindly. "But you will." He was right. I just didn't know how right yet. Monica Reyes called me back Tuesday morning, 40 minutes before I was due at work. Her voice was brisk and warm at the same time. The kind of combination I had learned over the years was rarer than it should be. I told her only that I had come into a large, sudden sum of money and needed immediate guidance on protecting it. I never used the word lottery. She never asked me to. She asked if I could come in Thursday at 10, and I rearranged 2 meetings without explanation and said yes. In the meantime, I went through the motions of my ordinary life with what I can only describe as careful, quiet grief. I sat at my desk. I processed claims. I ate lunch at my usual spot by the window in the break room. I watched Renee Castellano walk past my desk 3 separate times without meeting my eyes, which was new, because Renee had always made a point of eye contact. It was one of her tools, that flat, assessing look, like a customs officer who suspected you of something but hadn't proven it yet. Wednesday, something shifted. I had been quietly working through an older batch of files as part of a routine audit I'd requested back in September, one that Frank had delayed approving 3 separate times before finally signing off the week before. Buried in a stack of invoices from the previous fiscal year, I found it. A vendor reimbursement processed twice for the exact same amount, 6 weeks apart, approved both times by Renee Castellano. The vendor name wasn't one I recognized, and it didn't appear in any of our standard contractor registries. I photographed both documents quietly on my phone. That evening, I searched the vendor against the Oklahoma Secretary of State's business registry. The company had been registered 14 months earlier. Its registered agent was a man named Mark Castellano, Renee's husband. I sat at my kitchen table with that information in front of me and felt something settle into place. Not anger exactly, something quieter and steadier than anger. Clarity, the specific kind that arrives when you finally understand that you weren't imagining anything at all. You've been right the entire time, and no one believed you because no one had bothered to look where you were looking. I opened a new section of my notebook and labeled it work. I wrote down everything: dates, file numbers, dollar amounts, names. I photographed the pages and emailed them to myself under the subject line grocery list, boring enough that even a curious eye would slide right past it. Was this excessive caution? Maybe. But I had just discovered that the woman who'd been quietly undermining me for nearly a year appeared to be running something close to vendor fraud through the company. And I had also just won $74 million. And I was 58 years old, and I had raised a daughter alone and paid my own way through everything I had ever built, and I had absolutely no intention of becoming anybody's victim now. Thursday morning, I drove to Monica Reyes's office. She was younger than I'd pictured, mid-40s, a spotless desk, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting once, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You want a blind trust?" she said. "Yes. I want to stay off any public-facing document, as anonymous as Oklahoma allows." She nodded slowly. "Oklahoma does allow claiming through a trust. Your name won't be part of the public disclosure. The trust will be the claimant of record." She paused. "We need to move quickly. How long ago did you confirm the ticket?" 10 days, I said. "You have 180 days from the draw date to claim in Oklahoma," she said. "But the sooner we file, the sooner the legal protections actually kick in." We spent the next 2 hours building the structure together. She suggested something plain and geographic for the trust name, nothing personal, nothing traceable. We settled on the Bluestem Family Trust, named for the tall prairie grass that grows wild across half the state. I would be the sole beneficiary. An independent trustee would appear on all public filings. My name would never touch the Lottery Commission's press release. When I left her office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. Prepared, but when I got back to the office, something in the air had already changed. Renee was in Frank's glass-walled office, speaking quietly but with an intensity one hadn't seen from her before. She glanced up as I walked past and looked away a beat too fast. She was watching me. I couldn't know exactly what she suspected, but I recognized the posture of someone who had started calculating, someone wondering whether the quiet woman at the billing desk had become unpredictable. I went back to my desk, opened a spreadsheet, and looked calm and busy and entirely unremarkable. Inside, I understood something important. I was fighting 2 separate battles now on 2 separate fronts. One was the money, the trust, the legal architecture I needed to build around it. The other was work, Renee, the fraud, months of quiet professional gaslighting that had made me doubt my own careful observations. And the most useful thing I've learned in 58 years is this: when you're fighting on 2 fronts at once, you don't split your attention evenly. You figure out which battle, won cleanly, makes the other one smaller. 3 weeks later, the Bluestem Family Trust officially claimed the $74 million Powerball jackpot in the state of Oklahoma. Monica had coordinated everything through Hal Bregman's office, and the filing was clean. I had elected the lump sum, roughly $46.3 million before taxes, which after federal and state withholding came out to just over $31 million, landing in an account with my new trustee's name on it, not mine. Real numbers. Numbers that didn't feel entirely real, even as I stared at them. I still went to work that following Monday. I made coffee in the same break room. I smiled at Yolanda. I did not look at Renee. The Oklahoma Lottery Commission issued a short press release that afternoon. A trust entity had claimed the October jackpot. No name, no photograph, no human interest story. It should have stayed clean. It didn't. My sister Patty called me that same evening, which was unusual because we didn't typically talk on Mondays. Her voice had a particular texture I remembered from childhood. Careful, a little too cheerful, the sound of someone building slowly toward a request. "Nora, I was just thinking about you," she said. "I was telling my friend Deb how responsible you've always been. So together." "That's sweet, Patty," I said. A pause. "Did you hear about that lottery thing? The big one, out of that gas station on 71st. My stomach went still. "Which one?" "The Powerball. $74 million. They said some trust claimed it. Isn't that wild, that they're allowed to hide behind something like that?" Another pause. "Do you know anything about how trusts work, Nora?" I kept my voice light. "I do dental billing, Patty, not finance." "Where did you even hear about this?" "Oh, somebody at the salon mentioned it." "Never mind, I just thought it was interesting." We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing much. When I hung up, I sat very still and thought about what it meant that she had called, that she had brought up the jackpot unprompted, that she had specifically asked about trusts. My identity was protected, but the timing of that call told me someone in Patty's orbit had already started connecting threads I hadn't anticipated. And Patty, for all her warmth, would keep pulling at a thread until it came loose. The following Friday was worse. I arrived at work to find a sealed envelope sitting on my keyboard, no return address. Inside was a single index card, typed, not handwritten. "We know about the trust. We know about you. Be smart, Nora." My hands didn't shake, which surprised me. I looked around the office. Yolanda was on the phone. 2 of the junior clerks were at the printer. Renee's office sat empty. She was supposedly out at a vendor meeting. I photographed the card and the envelope and sealed both inside a plastic bag. From the parking garage during my lunch break, I called Monica. "Someone at your job knows," she said, calm as ever. "It looks that way." I told her about Renee, about the vendor fraud, about the timing of everything. There was a long silence on the line. "Nora, this is a threat," she said finally. "Depending on what they do next, it could be extortion. I want you to file a report with the Tulsa Police Department today, non-emergency line. Don't dramatize it. Don't confront anyone yourself. Just get it on record." I did exactly that. The following Monday, I asked Frank Delgado for a private meeting, and I told him, in flat, unemotional language, that I had documented a pattern of irregular claims processing over the past year, including specific instances I believed warranted a compliance review, and that I had already submitted copies of my documentation to HR. I hadn't yet, but I did that same afternoon. Frank's expression cycled through something complicated, the look of a man realizing a comfortable arrangement had suddenly become a liability. He said he would take it seriously. He said he'd look into it. 2 days later, Renee called in sick. She stayed out for 3 straight days. When she finally returned, she didn't speak to me. She didn't look at me. She walked past my desk with her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, and I watched her do it and thought, this is what the retreat of power actually looks like. Not dramatic, just quiet, a door closing somewhere down the hall. That weekend I drove out to a cabin near Tenkilla Lake, nothing extravagant, just a small place with a fireplace, and no cell signal for the last 2 miles of gravel road. I brought Pepper in his carrier. I brought my notebook. I sat on the porch under a blanket and watched the trees and didn't think about Renee or Patty or the money for 2 full days. I slept 10 hours both nights. I cooked eggs in the mornings and let Pepper have a last bite of bacon and watched a hawk circle slowly over the water, patient and unbothered, working out some private calculation only it could see. Driving back into Tulsa on Sunday evening, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at that particular moment. Gratitude. Not only for the money, though I was grateful for that too, but for the clarity, for the fact that I hadn't panicked, for the fact that I had a notebook and a lawyer and the good sense to drive out to a lake when the weight of it all got to be too much. The hawk doesn't panic either, I thought. It just waits. It started with flowers. I got home on a Tuesday to find a small bouquet sitting against my door, white daisies, a card tucked between the stems. I almost stepped past it before I stopped and picked it up. "Nora, we miss you. Family is everything. Love, Patty." I brought the flowers inside and set them on the counter and looked at them for a while. They were lovely. Patty had always had a gift for small, deliberate gestures, which was exactly what made those gestures so effective. She called that evening. "Did you get them?" Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in months. "I've been feeling like we've grown apart, Nora, and I don't like it." A pause, carefully vulnerable. "Roger actually reached out to me. Did you know that? He heard you might be going through some changes. He wanted to know if you were okay." I sat down slowly. Roger had reached out to Patty. Roger, who lived in Tampa, who hadn't called me directly in 3 years. Roger, whose wife had once complimented me for looking so put together, considering. "I'm fine," I said. "Just busy at work." "Of course," Patty said warmly. "Of course you are. I just want you to know, whatever's going on, I'm here. We're family." "I know that," I said. "I love you, Patty." "Love you too. We should do dinner soon." We agreed on a vague date, easy enough to reschedule later, and hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Pepper jumped onto the couch and pressed his head under my hand. I thought about what had just happened, not the words themselves, but the construction of it. The flowers, the softened voice, the strategic mention of Roger dropped in to suggest a whole network of people quietly paying attention, quietly letting me know I was being watched. Was it manipulation? Without question. Did that mean Patty didn't love me? No. Both things were true at once, and that was the hardest kind of truth to sit with. The following week, Christine herself, not Roger, sent me a Facebook message for the first time in 5 years. Hey Nora, thinking of you. Hope things are good on your end. Roger says hi, followed by a bright yellow sun emoji. I didn't respond. At work, Renee had shifted strategies. She was being pleasant now, surgically, professionally pleasant. She held the break room door for me. She left a neutral, complimentary note on one of my quarterly reports. She made no reference at all to what had passed between us. She was watching and waiting instead of escalating, which told me she was building a case of her own, or hoping to. So I matched her energy. I was thorough. I documented every task, every approval, every interaction with extra care. If she was building a file, I intended to build a better one. But the truth was, the weight of all of it, the money, the trust, the legal process still grinding along in the background, Patty, Renee, Christine, the anonymous card, had genuinely started to wear on me. I had been carrying it alone for almost 6 weeks. I'm a private person by nature, but there's a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from holding something enormous inside you while everyone around you assumes your life looks exactly the same as it did last month. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I called my friend Bev. Beverly Okafor was 62, a retired elementary school principal from Brookside, and we'd been friends since our daughters played on the same soccer team 15 years earlier. She was the most discreet person I knew, and there's a real difference between discreet and secretive. Secretive people hold on to things because it gives them leverage. Discreet people hold on to things because they understand certain things belong only to the person carrying them. We met at a small Vietnamese restaurant on Peoria Avenue on a Thursday night. I waited until our tea arrived. Bev, I said, I need to tell you something. She looked at me over her cup with that quality she's always had. Total presence. No phone on the table. No half attention. All right, she said. I told her everything. The ticket, the man who put it back, Hal Bregman, Monica, the trust, Patty, Renee, the card on my keyboard. She listened without a single interruption, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Are you sleeping? She asked. Better than a few weeks ago. Eating? Yes. Is your lawyer any good? She's excellent. Bev nodded slowly. Then you're doing everything right. She lifted her cup. Nora, you've handled this better than 90% of people would have. The question was never whether you'd survive it. It's just how long the noise lasts before it finally quiets down. She smiled. My advice is to keep doing exactly what you're doing. You don't need saving. You need someone across the table who tells you you're not crazy. You're not crazy, she said again, and we clinked our cups together like it was champagne, laughing quietly enough that the couple at the next table barely glanced over. I realized later that dinner was the first night in 6 weeks I had felt entirely like myself again. Patty came to Tulsa on a Saturday without calling ahead. She texted from the road, already 20 minutes away. Coming to see you. Bringing lunch. And something about that exclamation point, that manufactured spontaneity, told me the visit had been planned for a while. 20 minutes was exactly enough warning to make sure I'd be home, and not nearly enough time to prepare properly. I thought about not answering the door. Then I decided that wasn't who I wanted to be, and besides, if she'd come to play a hand, I wanted to see it played. She arrived with a bag from a local deli. Good bread, good cheese, a container of soup, and she'd done something new with her hair, or maybe it was just the lipstick. We sat at my kitchen table the way we had 100 times before, and for the first 20 minutes she was simply my sister. We talked about her job, about Julia's new boyfriend, a physical therapist named Marcus who I liked immediately, about a leaky faucet she'd been putting off fixing. It was genuinely pleasant, and I let it be pleasant because watching for a trap the entire time would have exhausted me and made me look like the one with the agenda. The soup was half gone when she set down her spoon. "Nora," she said, and her tone had shifted, softer but grounded now, serious in a way the earlier conversation hadn't been. "I'm going to say this because I love you and you deserve honesty." She held up a hand before I could respond. "I know something happened. I don't know exactly what. I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm just worried about you." She leaned in. "You're private, and I respect that. But whatever came your way, you shouldn't be navigating it alone. I don't want to see you taken advantage of by people who don't actually care about you." It was well done. I'll give her that. Concern wrapped around the offer, the implication that everyone else was dangerous while she alone was safe, the appeal to family loyalty dressed up as protection instead of self-interest. She was waiting for me to hand her the key. "Patty," I said carefully, "I appreciate that, I really do. And I promise you, I'm not navigating anything alone. I have good people helping me. Professionals." She blinked, a small recalibration. "I just mean, family should be involved." "Involved in what exactly?" I asked, my voice light, genuinely curious. "What is it you think I need help with?" There was a pause, the first one that sounded actually uncertain. "Whatever it is you're going through," she said, recovering. "I'm just busy at work," I told her. "I'm fine. I've been sleeping better than I have in years." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "I love you. When there's something to tell you, I will tell you. I promise." We finished the soup. She stayed another hour, and when she left, the hug at the door was real enough that it actually stung a little. But watching from the window as she pulled out of the driveway, I noticed her car sit idle at the curb for nearly 2 full minutes before she finally drove off. Just sitting there. I understood, or thought I did. She was texting someone, reporting that it hadn't worked. 2 days later, Roger called for the first time in 3 years. He opened with small talk, how I was doing, how Julia was doing, how the weather was down in Tampa. Friendly, easy. I answered honestly, because none of it required hiding anything. Then, almost as an aside, halfway through the call, he said, "I hear you might be looking into some investments. If you ever want a second opinion, my brother-in-law's a financial guy, does really well with high-net-worth clients." "I have a financial team already, Roger," I said. "But thank you." Silence. "Okay," he said. "Just offering." "I know," I said. "Tell Christine I said hi." I hung up and stood in my living room and felt the first genuine spike of something that wasn't calm. Not quite anger, something colder and more alert, the exact space between fear and readiness. They were talking to each other, Patty and Roger, comparing notes, running separate approaches, hoping I'd mistake the choreography for something spontaneous. The flowers, the Facebook message, the surprise visit, the phone call with the conveniently available brother-in-law. How long had this been going on? How long had they been watching and waiting and laying groundwork, hoping I'd mistake their coordination for love? I didn't let myself sit in the fear for long. I opened my notebook, wrote the date, wrote Roger, financial advisor, brother-in-law reference, and noted the time of the call. Then I called Monica. "Document it," she said, the same steady way she always said things. "And Nora, this actually helps your position." "How?" "Because if this ever becomes a legal matter, what you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's a coordinated pattern. That's evidence." I set the notebook down and looked at Pepper. "They're not going to stop," I said. "No," she agreed. "But you don't need them to stop. You just need to stay one step ahead." One step ahead. I wrote that down too. It was Monica who first used the word intervention, not the therapeutic kind, the legal kind. She'd been quietly monitoring the situation at Meadowbrook on my behalf, and she connected me with a white-collar defense and compliance attorney named Ellis Barrow, who reviewed everything I'd compiled on the Castellanos vendor fraud. By early February, 11 weeks after I'd first found that duplicated reimbursement, Ellis had enough to recommend going straight to Meadowbrook's regional board, bypassing Frank entirely. If Renee gets wind of this before the board meeting, she'll destroy records, Ellis told me. They almost always do. Then she won't get wind of it, I said. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday at the end of February. I wasn't invited to present. Ellis went in with my documentation instead. I went to work that day like any other. I processed claims. I ate lunch at my window table. I watched Renee walk to the copier and back twice. At 3:52 that afternoon, Frank walked out of his office and went straight to hers. I watched through the glass. Renee looked up, read his face, and then looked past him, directly at me. That look lasted maybe 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, I watched her understand. I could see the calculation she'd been running for months finally resolve, the answer landing wrong. She had built her entire strategy on the assumption that I was passive, that I noticed things and swallowed them because confronting them wasn't worth the effort. She had been wrong about that. Frank closed his office door. A week before all of that, I had called Patty and told her I needed to see her not in Tulsa. I suggested we meet at a diner off Highway 412 near Claremore, roughly halfway. She agreed immediately, which told me she assumed I was finally about to open the door she'd been pressing against for weeks. She was already there when I pulled in, sitting in a corner booth, a cup of coffee in front of her, wearing a blouse she'd clearly chosen with care. Roger was there too. I hadn't expected Roger. He must have flown in, or more likely had already been in Oklahoma waiting for this exact conversation. The two of them sitting together in a Claremore diner was either an enormous coincidence or the single most obvious coordinated pressure campaign I had ever personally witnessed. It wasn't a coincidence. I sat down across from both of them, ordered coffee, and said nothing about Roger's presence until it arrived. Then I looked at him. "I didn't know you were in Oklahoma." "Just passing through," he said, a lie so transparent it was almost sweet. I wrapped both hands around my mug. "I want to be straightforward with you both," I said. "I know you care about me, and I believe that's true, alongside whatever else is going on here." I paused. "But I know what the last few months have actually been. The calls, the visits, Patty, the message from Christine, Roger, the brother-in-law with the financial advice. I know it's been coordinated. I'm not angry, but I need you both to understand it's over." Roger opened his mouth. I lifted one hand slightly. "Let me finish. I have a lawyer. I have a financial team. I have a structure in place that protects everything, and none of what you're attempting can touch it." My voice was even, not cold, just clear. "If you want a relationship with me going forward, I would genuinely like that. But it will be honest. Not a campaign." Patty's face cycled through several expressions, caught, defensive, reaching for something, before landing on tears. "Real ones, I think, or close enough. I'm not running a campaign, Nora. I'm your sister. I was scared you were going to get taken advantage of. By strangers," I said gently, "or by the people sitting at this table right now?" The diner had gone quiet around us. A fork scraped a plate somewhere behind me. The bell over the door chimed as someone else left. Roger cleared his throat, wearing the exact expression of a man realizing partway through a negotiation that he's already lost it. "Nobody's trying to take anything from you," he said. "Good," I said. "Then we agree." I finished my coffee, paid for all 3 cups because I wanted to, and because generosity from a place of security says something on its own. Stood and put on my coat. "I love you both," I said. "Call me when you're ready for a real conversation." I walked out to my Corolla and drove home, and the AC wheezed the entire way, and for the first time in years that sound didn't feel like a symbol of everything I'd never had. It just felt like a sound. A small, temporary sound that would be gone soon enough. Renee Castellano was terminated from Meadowbrook Dental Partners on the 11th of March. The board's compliance review had been swift, and I was told, through channels I made sure not to look too curious about, thorough. The duplicated reimbursements weren't an isolated incident. Once the full vendor history was pulled, they found a pattern stretching back nearly 3 years. The shell company registered under Mark Castellano's name had collected just over $58,000 in fraudulent reimbursements for services that were never actually performed. In plain terms, it was embezzlement. Both Renee and Mark were referred to the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office. Frank Delgado was placed on administrative leave pending a separate review into what he had known, or should have known, was happening directly under his supervision. I got the whole update from Ellis Barrow in a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in the Meadowbrook parking garage. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat there for a minute before I drove home. What I felt wasn't triumph, exactly. It was closer to what I imagine a surgeon feels when a procedure goes exactly according to plan, the quiet satisfaction of having done the precise, careful work required, and having the outcome match the effort. I'd seen the problem. I'd documented it correctly. I'd handed it to the right people and let the right process run its course. The outcome was the outcome. It was enough. The days right after Renee's firing had a strange, held-breath quality around the office, the whole floor quietly recalibrating around an absence. Yolanda came by my desk and said, "I always felt like something was off with her." I nodded and said nothing. I had learned there was never any real value in saying "I told you so." The record already spoke for itself. Frank never returned from leave. By April, his position had been posted internally, and someone from HR mentioned, carefully, that the review into his supervision had not gone in his favor, though nobody ever spelled out the specifics to me directly, and I never asked twice. The Meadowbrook situation resolved fast, once it finally started moving. The other front took a little longer. By late February, the financial architecture around my winnings was fully in place. The trust had been funded. Monica had connected me with a fee-only financial advisory firm downtown. No commissions, no products to sell me, just honest hourly guidance, and over 4 sessions across 6 weeks, I began to actually understand what $31 million, properly managed, could look like as a long-term plan instead of an abstract number in an account. I gave myself a budget. I replaced the Corolla, nothing extravagant, just something newer and reliable that didn't sound like it was mourning something on the highway. I bought a 2025 Subaru Outback, dark green, and paid cash. The salesman checked the account balance twice, visibly rattled. I also made 3 decisions that had nothing to do with spending money and everything to do with who I wanted to be on the other side of all this. First, I told Julia. I drove out to Broken Arrow on a Sunday, brought groceries, cooked dinner in her small kitchen. Afterward, sitting on her couch with tea, I told her everything, the ticket, the man who'd put it back on the rack, the trust, the months of quiet work to protect it all. Her face moved through what felt like a dozen different expressions in under a minute. Then she started crying. Then she started laughing. Then she hugged me for a very long time. "Mom," she said into my shoulder, "you are the most you person I have ever known in my life." "Is that a good thing?" I asked. "It's the best thing," she said. Second, I set aside a specific amount, not enormous, but meaningful, in a separate account earmarked for Julia's future, student loans if she wanted them cleared, a down payment someday, whatever transition she might need help with when the time came. I had the paperwork drawn up before I ever told her it existed. The point was never the dollar figure. The point was the intention, deliberately extending care forward into her life without a single string attached. Third, I gave Patty and Roger nothing. This wasn't cruelty. It was, I'd come to understand, the most honest thing I could actually do. Handing either of them money now, in light of everything that had happened, wouldn't have been generosity. It would have been a reward for exactly the behavior they'd shown me, and I wasn't willing to teach either of them that lesson. I did call Patty in March. We had a genuinely honest conversation, maybe the most honest one we'd had in years. I told her I loved her, that the diner had hurt, that I understood why she'd done what she did, and that I needed time before I could figure out what came next between us. She was quiet for a long moment, Then she apologized. I believed her mostly. With Roger, there wasn't much left to say. We hadn't been close in years, and the phone call had been a calculated opportunity, not an act of love. I wished him well in the abstract and left it there. By April, I'd handed in my notice at Meadowbrook. I gave them 6 weeks, professional and clean, with letters of reference that would help anyone who deserved them. On my last day, Yolanda hugged me and said she hoped I was headed somewhere good. I told her I was. I drove out of the Meadowbrook parking garage for the final time in the dark green Subaru, and the engine made no sound at all except the quiet, steady hum of something reliable doing exactly what it was built to do. A year later, I was sitting on the porch of my new house, not extravagant, a well-kept craftsman near Brookside with 3 bedrooms and a big backyard oak that I'd left exactly as I found it, strung with the previous owner's string lights and everything. I paid cash. Standing in that kitchen the first time and looking out at the tree, I remember thinking, yes, this one. Pepper had claimed the window seat in the living room as his permanent post and spent his days there in complete contentment. I understood that feeling completely, in a way I don't think I could have explained to anyone a year earlier. I started consulting part-time for a local nonprofit focused on financial literacy for low-income families, 12 hours a week, no more. The work used everything I already knew, systems, patterns, careful records, and pointed it somewhere it actually mattered. The rest of my time belonged entirely to me. Julia and Marcus got engaged that spring. The dinner was at my house. She cried. I cried. It was loud and messy and exactly right. Patty and I were speaking again, carefully, honestly, the way you test ice before you trust your full weight on it. She started therapy. I was glad to hear it. Renee Castellano was eventually charged with 2 felony counts in Tulsa County. Mark took a plea deal. I didn't follow the case too closely after that. I'd done my part. Roger and Christine separated that winter. I heard it secondhand from Julia. I felt something complicated about it and decided not to examine it too closely. Sometimes in the evenings, sitting on that porch with Pepper's chin resting on my foot and the oak leaves moving overhead, I think about that old man in the flannel jacket at the Quick Trip, the one who picked up the last ticket, held it, and set it back down without a word. I've never seen him again, and I never learned his name, and some nights I wonder what made him change his mind in that small window of time. Maybe he simply didn't feel like spending $2 that night. Maybe some quiet instinct told him it wasn't his to take. I'll never know, but I've come to think that the ticket itself was never really the point of any of this. It was the excuse. What actually mattered was everything it forced to the surface, the people who showed up for me honestly, and the people who only showed up once they smelled money. I would have learned that difference eventually, one way or another. The ticket just made it happen all at once, and it made me pay attention in a way I might never have managed on my own. The money hadn't changed who I was. It had simply cleared out enough room for the person I'd always been to finally be seen. I'd been this woman the entire time. I just hadn't been visible. What would you have done if a stranger set that ticket back down in front of you and Hal Bregman's voice on the phone told you not to tell a soul before you understood what you were holding? Could you have waited? If this story kept you here until the very end, you already know what to do. Subscribe to Kate's Fortune Stories and tell me down in the comments what city you watched this from. I've read every single one, and I'll see you in the very next story whenever it finds its way to you.